Darwin's Dangerous Legacy: How a Theory Became a License for Barbarism. This audio is adapted from the article Darwin's Dangerous Legacy by Sami Bsoul. I know the so-called scientists, the atheists, the self-proclaimed educated will have their throats burn as they read these pages. Hold your nerves, sit calm, read. You will not like what you see. Personally, when I hear the name Darwin, I feel disgust. Not for the man himself, but for the consequences that his theory, misapplied, misinterpreted, and idolized, has unleashed on humanity. This is the least you should feel when you hear it. Pause, reflect, consider what a simple idea, treated as moral law rather than scientific hypothesis, has cost the world. This article is not a lecture. It is a reckoning, a confrontation, a long overdue exposure of a theory that has masqueraded as truth for over a century, while leaving a trail of moral collapse and human suffering in its wake. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, natural selection, the survival of the fittest, these are the phrases that echo through classrooms, textbooks, and popular science. Yet, for all its fame, Darwinism remains a theory, not law, a model of biological processes. And yet, human beings have twisted it into a philosophy, a moral compass, and a license to kill. How does a theory of nature become a blueprint for barbarism? That is the question this article answers. Look at history. Look at the consequences. European colonizers, armed with rifles and a Darwinian worldview, treated entire peoples as expendable. In Australia, 90% of indigenous populations were decimated under policies justified by the law of the strong ruling the weak. In Africa, the Americas, New Zealand, the same pattern repeats. Advanced societies declaring the primitive expendable, rationalized by a misapplied theory. Then came Hitler, Darwin's loyal student in practical cruelty. In Mein Kampf, he echoes the phrases survival of the stronger, elimination of the weaker, shaping a better society by eradicating those deemed unfit. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the fittest and everyone else, gas chambers, smoke, ash, over 20 million lives wiped from the earth, and history cannot look away. Communist regimes, atheistic in principle, repeated the same pattern. Without God, without universal morality, the state becomes the arbiter of right and wrong. Tens of millions were murdered under Soviet, Chinese, and Cambodian regimes, victims of ideology, of selective morality, of Darwinian logic applied without conscience. R.J. Rummel's death, by government and the Black Book of Communism, document these atrocities in painstaking detail. Darwinism alone did not kill. Godlessness alone did not kill. But the combination of a worldview that stripped morality of absolutes and replaced it with survival, desire, and power became an instrument of mass death, oppression, and moral collapse. And it continues today, quietly, invisibly embedded in education, culture, and ideology. This article is a warning, a mirror, a challenge. It is a journey through the chain: scientific idea, ideological misapplication, systematic atrocity, philosophical fallout, moral reckoning. I will follow this chain with facts, with clarity, and with a voice that does not apologize for the truth. You will see how a theory of life was transformed into a weapon. You will see how morality was made negotiable. And you will understand the stakes if humanity fails to discern science from ideology. I write not to attack blindly, but to illuminate, to reveal the hidden consequences of a theory treated as a moral absolute, to provide a record, a warning, and perhaps a guidepost toward restoring conscience, dignity, and objective morality. The journey is uncomfortable. It is painful. It will evoke disgust, perhaps anger. But these are the reactions the truth deserves. Imagine a forest. Some animals are fast, some slow. A predator attacks. The fast survive, the slow die. Over generations, the fastest survive, the slow vanish. Now imagine animals with thick fur versus thin fur in a cold climate. The thick-furred survive, the others perish. This is evolution by natural selection. what Darwin called natural selection. Simple, biological, factual. From this emerges the law misapplied to humanity. The world advances by eliminating the weak and preserving the strong. Nature is a battlefield. The better fitted, stronger, faster, smarter, more adaptable survive and pass on their traits. The weaker eventually disappear. Once this principle was extended beyond biology into morality, society, and politics, it became a justification for eugenics, eliminating the unfit, racism and colonialism, superior races destined to rule over weaker ones, atheism and materialism, no higher moral law, only the law of survival. Darwin framed this in biology as nature's law, but in culture, it became a license for cruelty, a dangerous illusion, nature mistaken for morality. Hitler did not take his cruelty from the Bible or any religion, he took it from Darwin. In Mein Kampf, he echoes the slogans of natural selection, survival of the stronger, elimination of the weaker, shaping a better society by exterminating the unfit. The Aryan race, blonde hair, blue eyes, was declared the fittest. Jews, Slavs, the disabled, the elderly, even children, were consigned to smoke and ash. Over 20 million lives were erased. This is Darwinism applied as worldview, not science, not progress, barbarism dressed in evolutionary language. European colonizers wore Darwin's vocabulary like a uniform. The advanced considered themselves fit. The colonized were primitive and expendable. Extermination, displacement, and cultural erasure were rationalized as a necessary step of human progress. Australia's indigenous populations suffered catastrophic decline under policies justified by selection logic. Science had been weaponized into policy. Communism, the utopia promising equality, became a machinery of mass extermination. Without God, morality is defined by the state. Tens of millions were purged in the Soviet Union, China, and Cambodia. Famines, executions, forced labor, and engineered social catastrophes were all justified as service to survival or ideology. R.J. Rummel, Death by Government, and the editors of the Black Book of Communism document these atrocities in grim detail. If Darwinian logic dehumanized the unfit, atheistic regimes provided the political instrument to act on it. The result? Systematic mass murder on a scale that stains the claim of progress with blood. Evolution is the first principle every atheist leans on. No God, no eternal law, no fixed measure of right or wrong. Morality becomes whatever the individual feels, whatever the group decides, whatever serves power or pleasure. If God does not exist, then everything is permitted, not hypothetically, but inevitably. Lust, desire, and personal ambition become the highest aim. Ask yourself, is there a prohibition list in atheism? No. No universal thou shalt not, no transcendent standard. Morality is negotiable, contingent, and ultimately subjective. Darwinism is dressed as law. The strong, clever, ambitious, and self-serving survive and define right and wrong. Atheism, in this light, is a cruel religion masquerading as freedom, producing unchecked power, ego, and cruelty. Darwin's writings in The Descent of Man suggest morality evolved like physical traits. Morality is adaptive, not absolute. Killing, exploitation, or domination can be justified if they serve survival or advantage. Crime becomes relative. One man's atrocity is another man's step of progress. The stronger survives becomes not just biology, but a license for power. Nietzsche, social Darwinists, eugenicists, and Hitler extended this principle. There is no universal law. Morality is whatever promotes the fit and eliminates the unfit. Once God is removed, man makes himself the lawmaker. Instinct replaces divine order. Murder, genocide, oppression, all can be justified by survival or progress. The unmistakable chain. Darwin, theory of survival. Social Darwinism, ideology dressed as morality. colonialism, Hitler, communism, real-world execution of selective survival. The result: tens of millions of victims, cultures erased, moral collapse. Darwinism does not merely describe nature, it dethrones morality. It whispers, if your instincts tell you it is right, then it is right. From this whisper, history birthed eugenics, gas chambers, and gulags. Charles Darwin is often treated as a figure beyond reproach, the saint of biology, the man who explained life itself. But let's cut through the reverence and look at what he actually said and what his theory implies. At its core, Darwin's idea is simple, observable, and factual. Life changes over time through a process he called natural selection. In any population, there is variation. Some individuals are faster, stronger, or better adapted to their environment. The world is not kind, it is a battlefield. Resources are limited. Every creature struggles to survive. Some survive, some perish. Those best suited to their environment, the fittest, are more likely to survive and pass on their traits to the next generation. Those less fit gradually disappear. Over generations, these small, cumulative changes drive evolution. Darwin illustrated this with examples from nature. Birds with varying beak sizes, animals with thick or thin fur, or predators and prey in constant struggle. Over time, the species becomes better adapted to its environment, simple, biological, observational. He framed this as biology, not morality. Darwin was describing the mechanics of life, not telling humans how to behave. Yet, he did venture beyond the physical world. In The Descent of Man, 1871, he explored the evolution of social instincts and morality. Here, Darwin's words hint at something more troubling. Morality, he suggested, is not absolute or God-given, but evolved, relative, and adaptive. What one society calls good, another might see as bad. What one group calls crime, another might see as progress. The line between right and wrong is not fixed. It moves with human instincts and social advantage. Even here, in his cautious, academic way, Darwin introduces the seeds of moral relativism. If morality is a product of evolutionary survival, then there is no universal law to constrain human action. Survival itself, instinct, and social advantage become arbiters of right and wrong. This is not speculation. Darwin wrote, "The moral sense has been developed in man, like every other mental quality, by the same process as any other faculty. Morality is desirable in relation to the good of the individual and society, not imposed by divine command. What one group considers ethical may differ entirely from another's view, depending on the struggle for existence. These statements may sound neutral or academic, but their implications are explosive. If morality is relative, if right and wrong evolve with circumstance, if survival and adaptation dictate ethical standards, then humans can, in principle, justify any act, however brutal, under the banner of necessary or advantageous." This is the origin of the idea that later thinkers, colonizers, social Darwinists, and even dictators would seize upon. Nature becomes law. The strong define right and wrong. The weak are expendable. Darwin's theory, framed as science, contains the blueprint that, when misapplied, can be weaponized into ideology, social policy, and atrocity. At this stage, however, it remains a theory of life, grounded in observation, gradual change, and inheritance, not yet moralized, not yet turned into a justification for human cruelty. For now you saw the seeds of Darwin's idea. Here you will see their shadow, the moral vacuum. Darwin did not just describe the mechanics of life. He suggested that morality itself is a product of evolution, contingent, adaptive, and relative. What one society calls right, another may call wrong. What one age elevates as virtue, another discards as vice. Darwin wrote cautiously in The Descent of Man, "The moral sense is shaped by instincts, social utility, and survival. It evolves like physical traits. Morality is not handed down by God, not fixed in stone, not absolute. It shifts with circumstances. Consider the implications. If morality is adaptive, then killing may be justified if it secures survival or advantage. Exploitation can be considered acceptable if it benefits the stronger group. Atrocity can be rationalized as progress when viewed through the lens of evolutionary advantage. One society sees crime, another sees progress. One group celebrates conquest, another suffers extermination. There is no universal standard, no divine arbiter, no ultimate measure of good and evil. Morality is negotiable. It bends to power, desire, and circumstance. Here is the essence. Nature is law, God is absent, human morality is negotiable. This is the moral vacuum Darwin opened. It is subtle, easy to miss if you focus only on the biology, but its consequences echo through history, as I will show later. When humans internalize this principle, they make themselves the measure of right and wrong. If your instincts tell you it is right, it is right. If your social calculation suggests an action advances survival, then it is justified. The strong define morality. The weak are expendable. This is not philosophy. This is reality, quietly awaiting misapplication. Darwin did not prescribe genocide, colonialism, or totalitarian regimes, but by describing morality as relative and contingent, he inadvertently gave later thinkers a framework they could exploit. The warning is clear. Without God, without absolute law, humans alone become lawgivers. And when humans write the rules based on instinct, advantage, or desire, blood and suffering inevitably follow. Darwin's theory of natural selection, described in biological terms, was soon twisted into something much more dangerous, a moral license for conquest and extermination. European colonizers, armed with rifles and ideology, interpreted survival of the fittest as a justification for domination. If nature favors the strong and eliminates the weak, why should humans hesitate to do the same? This was the essence of social Darwinism. The advanced are entitled to rule, the primitive are expendable. It was a worldview that sanctioned oppression, conquest, and genocide in the name of progress. Science, misapplied, became ideology. Observation became justification. Nature became law. Australia, a case study in extermination. Nowhere is this more evident than in Australia. When European settlers arrived, they brought guns, disease, and the belief that the indigenous population was primitive and expendable. Colonizers saw themselves as agents of evolution, advancing civilization by eliminating those deemed unfit. The consequences were catastrophic. Estimates suggest that up to 90% of the indigenous population perished under colonial policies. Displacement, massacres, and forced removals were rationalized as a natural, even moral, progression. Survival of the fittest was no longer biology, it was law. Africa, European powers carved the continent into colonies, exploiting resources and subjugating peoples under the pretext of civilizing lesser races. The logic of selection justified slavery, forced labor, and territorial conquest. The Americas. Indigenous populations were decimated, culturally and physically, under the banner of progress and civilization. Disease, warfare, and land theft were not incidental. They were rationalized as evolutionary necessity. New Zealand, Maori populations suffered under colonization, with policies of displacement and assimilation justified by assumptions of racial and cultural inferiority. Across continents, the same pattern emerges. Colonizers justified brutality as the natural order, the survival of the strong over the weak, the advancement of the fit over the unfit. Darwin's words, originally meant to describe nature, were weaponized into ideology. Science became an executioner's handbook. This is social Darwinism, a theory of life misapplied as a moral and political law. The advanced ruled, the primitive were expendable. entire peoples were erased, and the moral language of progress cloaked these atrocities in the rhetoric of civilization, science, and inevitability. Darwin's ideas, in the hands of colonizers, became a blueprint for systemic cruelty. What was once a theory of nature transformed into a justification for conquest, oppression, and genocide. Social Darwinism turned evolution into ideology, ideology into policy, and policy into catastrophe. If social Darwinism provided a moral license for colonial conquest, Adolf Hitler turned it into industrialized murder. He did not stumble into cruelty blindly. He consciously adopted Darwinian logic and applied it with a terrifying efficiency. In Mein Kampf, Hitler repeatedly echoes the principles of natural selection, survival of the stronger, elimination of the weaker. These are not mere metaphors for struggle. They are directives for action. Hitler saw humanity as a battlefield, a contest in which the fit must dominate and the unfit must vanish. So, who survives? For Hitler, the fittest were clear: blonde hair, blue eyes, physically strong, culturally dominant, the Aryan race. All others, Jews, Slavs, the disabled, the elderly, even children, were deemed expendable. In Hitler's worldview, the elimination of the unfit was not crime, but moral duty, a service to evolution itself, to the survival of the fittest. Darwin gave the seed, Hitler harvested it in smoke and ash. Over 20 million lives were erased under the Nazi regime, an estimated toll meticulously documented by historians. This is not abstract speculation. It is fact, undeniable and horrendous. Gas chambers, mass shootings, starvation, forced labor, the tools of selection applied to human populations. Ideological indoctrination, convincing an entire nation that extermination was not evil, but natural. Scientific justification, pseudo-Darwinian language masked as rational policy. Hitler's Germany is the living demonstration of Darwinism, taken as social law, as moral license, as a blueprint for genocide. The survival of the fittest, when misapplied to human society, does not lead to progress. It leads to barbarism. And let me remind you of some of the historical consequences. Over 20 million people killed. Historians' estimates vary, but even conservative counts underscore the scale. Entire communities erased, cultures destroyed, lives extinguished under the banner of better fit. The rationalization of atrocity through Darwinian and pseudo-scientific rhetoric became a moral mask for industrial-scale murder. This leaves no ambiguity. The horrors of Nazi Germany did not emerge from mystical or religious texts. They emerged from a misapplied scientific idea, weaponized by ideology and reinforced by moral relativism. If Hitler demonstrated Darwinian logic applied to race, communist regimes demonstrated it applied to ideology. Here, Darwin's principle, survival of the fittest, elimination of the weak, merged with atheistic political ideology to create state-sanctioned mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Without God, without universal moral law, the state became the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong. The result? Morality was defined by ideology, and those deemed unfit, counter-revolutionaries, class enemies, or simply inconvenient humans became targets for extermination. The evidence is indisputable. Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin's policies, purges, forced collectivization, and engineered famines led to millions of deaths. R.J. Rummel estimates roughly 20-25 million. China, Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution caused tens of millions of deaths through famine, purges, and re-education campaigns. Cambodia, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge deliberately targeted perceived enemies of the revolution, killing over 1 million people in a few short years. These figures come from Death by Government, R.J. Rummel, and the Black Book of Communism, which catalog the staggering human cost with meticulous research. Communist regimes did not claim divine authority. They claimed scientific and ideological rationality. They justified mass murder as necessary for progress, survival, and the advancement of the state. Darwinian principle: the weak, the unfit, the inefficient do not survive. Atheistic ideology: God is absent, morality is defined by human power and ideology. Practical outcome: systematic mass murder rationalized as necessity. Darwinism provided the philosophical seed. Atheism removed the moral constraint. Combined, they created a license for mass murder, survival of the fittest applied to ideology instead of biology, with catastrophic human cost. In this moral vacuum, there is no inherent wrong. Killing, exploitation, and oppression are permissible if they serve the state, ideology, or the survival of the fit class. The human cost becomes a secondary concern, a statistical byproduct of progress. This is the chilling continuity of Darwin's idea beyond biology. Once morality is contingent, survival becomes law, and humans act as judge, jury, and executioner. History leaves no ambiguity. Tens of millions perished because Darwinian logic, combined with atheistic ideology, offered both justification and instrument for human extermination. You may say, I misread Darwin, claiming he never advocated exterminating the weak, that survival of the fittest is descriptive, not moral. But here's the subtlety critics often ignore. Descriptive ideas are seeds that grow in human hands. Darwin framed natural selection as biology, yes, but in The Descent of Man, he explicitly explores social instincts and morality, suggesting morality itself evolves. If morality evolves, then it is not absolute. And if it is not absolute, humans, deliberately or ideologically, can use the idea to justify the elimination of the unfit. To dismiss this as misreading is to overlook the moral implications that Darwin himself opened. Science may be descriptive, but ideas have consequences. I assume you are thinking Darwin meant best adapted, not necessarily strongest. True, but this is hair-splitting. The social and political misapplications did not pause for semantics. The world acted on the idea that strength, fitness, or superiority justified survival and dominance. In human society, adapted was interpreted as intelligence, race, or ideology, and history shows us the catastrophic results. Precision in biology cannot erase human application of a scientific metaphor as a moral law. If you are thinking modern biology has advanced far beyond Darwin, then yes, in laboratory and genetic terms, that is true. But here's the crucial point. The misuse of Darwin's original ideas, not modern genetics, drove human atrocities. Hitler, colonialists, and communist ideologues operated with 19th century Darwinian logic, not with contemporary evolutionary theory. Using the sophistication of modern science as a defense is irrelevant when the misapplication occurred decades before our genomic era. You may insist that Darwin's theory cannot be blamed for atrocities because science describes, it does not prescribe. But if you think this absolves Darwinism's cultural consequences, then you are ignoring how humans transform observation into ideology. Observation may be neutral, but human interpretation and application is never neutral. Science can be twisted, misrepresented, or weaponized. History shows it happens again and again. To claim science is innocent is to ignore reality. I assume you are thinking one can accept evolution without being an atheist, and vice versa. Yes, strictly speaking, that is true, but the critique misses the point. My article does not claim all atheists are murderous Darwinists, nor that every Darwinist is an atheist. The argument is historical and conceptual. Darwinian logic, when combined with atheistic moral relativism, opens a moral vacuum. That vacuum has been exploited repeatedly to justify mass murder. Separating labels does not erase consequences. If you are thinking, my disgust is subjective and irrelevant, then I respond, disgust here is a rhetorical and intellectual tool. It is not blind emotion, it is the moral response to historical patterns. When a theory, however scientific in intent, becomes the philosophical foundation for tens of millions of deaths, disgust is both rational and instructive. To call it emotion over reason is to misunderstand that ethical judgment is inseparable from human reasoning about consequences. You may say Hitler drew more from nationalism, anti-Semitism, and eugenics than from Darwin, but here is the clarity critics avoid. Hitler repeatedly referenced Darwin, survival of the fittest, and evolutionary logic in Mein Kampf. He was ideologically literate in Darwinian terms, even if other factors existed. Saying Darwin had nothing to do with Hitler is like saying a spark has nothing to do with a fire because wind also blows. I assume you are thinking eugenics was promoted by others, not uniquely Darwin. True, but Darwin provided the scientific veneer that made eugenics plausible. Without the concept of natural selection, without the language of fitness and survival, eugenics would have lacked intellectual credibility. Religions or other ideologies did not frame the weak as biologically expendable in the same systematic scientific way. And if you are thinking Europeans were brutal before Darwin, then yes, conquest and violence existed. But my critique is about ideology, not chronology. Darwin's vocabulary, survival of the fittest, progress through elimination, provided moral justification, a language colonizers used to rationalize and celebrate genocide. Pre-Darwin brutality lacked this philosophical cloak. Post-Darwin brutality wore it like armor. You may notice a curious phenomenon. Whenever atheists engage in debate, whenever they feel the need to justify human behavior, they immediately cite Darwin as if natural selection were scripture and the origin of species their sacred text. I assume you are thinking, surely they have other grounds, but history and human behavior suggest otherwise. Without Darwin, what foundation remains? Let us be precise. Atheism, by definition, removes God from the moral equation. Remove divine law, remove eternal standard, and you are left with what? Some will reach for humanism, reason, Kantian ethics, noble in theory, yet fragile in practice. In the vacuum of absolutes, they need an anchor. That anchor often becomes Darwinian selection. Suddenly, the descriptive science of biology is elevated into cosmic authority, as if evolution itself dictates what humans ought to do, what is fit, and what is unfit. If you are thinking Darwin is science, not religion, then consider this. When human behavior is measured by survival, fitness, adaptation, or genetic advantage, the moral compass has shifted from conscience to calculation. The atheist in these moments becomes a disciple, quoting Darwin with the fervor of scripture, not with critical reflection. The very one who rejects God has, in effect, replaced one absolute with another, blind to the irony. Consider the implications. If Darwin did not exist, if the origin of species had never been published, where would this authority rest? What anchor would validate the moral choices of those who claim atheism as their guiding principle? Absent God, absent Darwin, they would confront the void, and there is no universal law to tell them right from wrong. This is not speculation. This is history. It is in this vacuum that atrocities occur, rationalized by the mantra of survival of the fittest, moral relativism, or the selective logic of nature itself. In essence, Darwin becomes a quasi-divine figure, revered, cited, and unquestioned by those who have rejected all other higher authority. The irony is exquisite. The atheist proclaims freedom from God, yet worships Darwin in practice. They have, unknowingly, substituted the law of biology for the law of conscience, and call it morality. This is the genius of the critique. It is subtle, almost invisible. No cross or scripture marks the crime. No prayer justifies the action. Yet the consequence is identical. Moral absolutes evaporate. Human life becomes negotiable, and power, ambition, or desire fills the vacuum. Darwin, the scientist, never intended this. But in the hands of those searching for a foundation beyond God, he has been elevated into an idol, a secular deity of survival. And so when an atheist approaches and cites Darwin with authority, remember, It is not science they are quoting, it is faith, dressed in evolutionary language. They may believe themselves liberated, rational, enlightened, but in this moment, Darwin is their God, and survival is their scripture. History has shown what happens when Darwin's theory is divorced from morality, and morality is divorced from God. Atheism, by definition, removes divine law from the equation. Without God, there is no universal standard for right or wrong. Ethics becomes subjective, contingent, and negotiable. Lust, pleasure, ambition, and self-interest dominate the ethical calculus. The strongest, cleverest, or most ruthless define morality for themselves, and in some cases, for entire populations. What one person deems virtuous, another sees as crime. What one society calls necessary, another sees as atrocity. There is no transcendent measure, no ultimate arbiter. Darwinism provides a convenient anchor for this moral relativism. Survival of the fittest, elimination of the weak, and adaptation to circumstance can easily be extended from biology into human ethics. The weak can be removed, the strong preserved, and this is not just tolerated, but rationalized as necessary, natural, or even progressive. Atheism does not inherently dictate cruelty, but in the absence of universal moral law, Darwinian logic can easily fill the void. The result is a worldview in which right and wrong are defined not by conscience or divine command, but by survival, advantage, and social calculation. This is the philosophical consequence of the patterns we've already seen. Hitler, colonial regimes, communist states. Each relied on subjective morality informed by a Darwinian view of life. The strong define right. The weak are expendable. Morality is adaptive, yet it is crucial to remember Darwinism is a theory, not law. Evolution describes biological change over time. It does not prescribe human ethics. Atheism allows humans to act without divine constraint. Together, when misapplied, they create a subjective, potentially cruel morality in practice. In short, the combination of godless ethics and Darwinian reasoning does not lead to moral clarity or progress. It leads to a moral vacuum, a space where ambition, lust, and power decide who lives and who dies. And history shows again and again that the consequences are catastrophic. It is needed to draw a clear line. Darwin's theory is science, not a blueprint for human morality or social law. Natural selection explains biological change over time. It describes how species adapt, survive, and evolve. It does not dictate who should live, who should die, or what constitutes ethical behavior. Yet history shows what happens when this distinction is ignored. Applying survival of the fittest logic to human society is a category error, a mistake of thinking that a descriptive law of nature can serve as a prescriptive law for human behavior. The consequences are catastrophic: genocide, colonial oppression, state-sponsored mass murder, and moral relativism run amok. Science without moral grounding. Science alone cannot tell us right from wrong. When divorced from ethics or conscience, knowledge becomes dangerous. Observation is neutral, interpretation is human. Left unchecked, misinterpretation can justify atrocities. Darwinism, when treated as a social or moral law, is no longer biology, it is ideology. And ideology, unmoored from ethical constraints, becomes a weapon. Hitler, colonial powers, and communist regimes all demonstrate this truth. Science without moral grounding is not progress, it is peril. We have traced the path from Darwin's biological observations to colonial conquest, from Hitler's genocidal policies to the mass killings under atheist regimes. We have seen the moral vacuum created when natural selection is misapplied, when God is removed, and when humans become their own lawgivers. History has paid a staggering price. The lesson is clear. Humanity cannot rely on Darwinian theory or atheistic moral relativism alone. Survival of the fittest is not a guide to justice, ethics, or human dignity. Biological fact is not a prescription for human behavior. Subjective morality without higher standards is a recipe for cruelty. If science explains life but does not prescribe values, then moral truth must come from something beyond observation. Conscience, ethical reasoning, or higher law, divine or philosophical, is essential to prevent humanity from justifying atrocity in the name of progress. Without this anchor, ambition, lust, ideology, and self-interest fill the void, and the strong define right while the weak suffer. Objective morality is not about limiting freedom. It is about protecting humanity from itself. It is the safeguard that prevents theories of survival from becoming instruments of death. It is the boundary that separates science from ideology, description from prescription, observation from justification. You may argue morality can exist without God via humanism, Kant, utilitarianism. But here's the sharp point. Secular frameworks rely on human consensus or reasoning. They do not provide absolute enforcement. History shows that when power, ideology, or ambition dominates, subjective reasoning collapses into opportunistic morality. Universal morality without God exists in theory, but in practice, humans require constraints beyond themselves, or tragedy follows. I assume you are thinking acknowledging evolved morality is not endorsing cruelty. True in theory, but if morality is adaptive and contingent, as Darwin suggested, there is no inherent prohibition against cruelty. Evolution describes tendencies, not ethics, and humans can easily choose violence, elimination, or oppression under the guise of progress. The critic's reassurance is intellectually correct, but historically irrelevant. If you are thinking atheists act morally, yes, many do. But my argument is about systemic consequences, not individual behavior. Remove God, remove moral absolutes, introduce Darwinian logic, and the door to cruelty swings wide. Individual goodness does not erase systemic patterns. You may say religion also kills, true, but my argument is not exclusivity, it is pattern recognition. Darwinism offered a secular, scientific justification for killing. Religious atrocities often claimed divine authority. Darwinism allowed human beings to justify mass murder without divine accountability, and that is historically novel and morally dangerous. You may argue I highlight the worst examples. I reply, these examples exist, are documented, and illustrate the principle. The purpose is not to deny counterexamples, but to show what happens when Darwinian logic is weaponized. Highlighting extreme consequences is methodologically sound and necessary. If you are thinking history is nuanced, yes, but the core pattern is clear and undeniable. Darwinian principles plus moral relativism resulted atrocities. Complexity does not negate the chain. It enriches context without altering causality. You may argue correlation is not ground for causation. True, but the evidence shows conceptual adoption, citation, and explicit ideological use of Darwinian logic. Hitler, communists, colonialists read, referenced, and acted on the principles. To dismiss this is to pretend ideas exist in a vacuum. I assume some will be quick to cry, straw man. But notice carefully, this work does not caricature atheists as cruel individuals, nor does it misstate Darwin's biology. It critiques the historical misuse of Darwinism as a cultural license and the systemic moral vacuum that emerges when absolute standards are removed. To call this a straw man is not a refutation. It is a deflection, avoiding the uncomfortable historical record. You may argue this undermines secular ethics. The response is, secular ethics exist, but history shows they are insufficient when ideology weaponizes Darwinian logic. Pointing this out strengthens the argument for robust, objective morality, not for suppressing secular thought. You may ask, why do humans so eagerly follow destructive ideologies, even when the consequences are catastrophic? If you are thinking that people are inherently evil or uniquely cruel, then think again. The truth is more subtle, more insidious, and far more human. History demonstrates that individuals do not commit atrocities because they are monsters. They commit atrocities because psychology and society conspire to make cruelty seem normal, justified, or even virtuous. Concepts such as groupthink, authority, obedience, cognitive bias, and moral disengagement provide the architecture for this moral collapse. Groupthink is the phenomenon where individuals suppress doubts and conform to the perceived will of the group. Consider the colonists in Australia, the bureaucrats in Nazi Germany, or the functionaries of the Soviet Union. In each case, the collective mindset transformed moral hesitation into socially sanctioned action. Individuals ceased to question the morality of what they were doing. Compliance became loyalty. You may say, but these were extreme historical circumstances. Yet, groupthink is not rare. It is a universal human tendency lurking in every organization, classroom, or workplace. Authority, obedience reinforces this effect. Psychologists Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo demonstrated it empirically. In Milgram's famous experiment, ordinary people were willing to administer what they believed were lethal electric shocks to another human simply because an authority figure instructed them to do so. In Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, ordinary college students assigned to guards' roles adopted cruelty toward prisoners within days, as if it were natural. If you are thinking, these are laboratory simulations, not real genocide, consider that these experiments reveal human tendencies, not exceptions. In the right ideological environment, these tendencies scale catastrophically. Cognitive biases, such as the need for moral rationalization and confirmation bias, further cement destructive ideologies. People selectively interpret evidence to justify their behavior and ideology, convincing themselves that extermination, oppression, or social engineering is not evil, but progress. If you are thinking, surely people recognize the wrong, then you underestimate the human capacity for self-deception and ideological rationalization. Here, Darwinian logic provides an irresistible hook. Natural selection, survival of the fittest, the law of nature itself. These concepts offer a science-based morality. The appeal is almost hypnotic. In a world where God is absent, where no divine law constrains behavior, why not turn to what seems like an objective empirical standard? Here is the genius or the horror of this thinking. Humans desperately seek authority for their moral decisions, and Darwinian science, stripped of its descriptive limitations, becomes a surrogate. You may imagine that secular societies are immune because they value reason. But reason alone cannot generate universal moral authority. In secular or atheist frameworks, when conscience is internalized as subjective and morality is treated as adaptive or contingent, Darwinian concepts provide a template for what is permissible. Kill the weak, rational. Exterminate the unfit, pragmatic. Build society through selective elimination, scientific. The human mind, when faced with moral vacuum, will elevate the descriptive into the prescriptive. The consequence is chillingly evident. Hitler and the Nazi elite did not invent cruelty out of nothing. They clothed it in the language of evolution, in the authority of science, giving ordinary bureaucrats permission to act against conscience. Communist functionaries similarly invoked the logic of historical necessity and progress, echoing Darwinian reasoning to justify famine, purges, and labor camps. You may argue that ideology is the key, not Darwin, but ideology, without a science-based framework, lacks the same seductive power. Darwin provided the intellectual armor for moral disengagement. In short, humans are drawn to scientific morality because it appears objective, immutable, and beyond reproach. Yet it is precisely this appearance that masks its moral fragility. Remove God, remove absolutes, and suddenly natural selection is no longer a biological metaphor, but a license for power, cruelty, and social engineering. The psychology of obedience, conformity, and rationalization ensures that individuals will act as if this license is real, even when every instinct of empathy screams otherwise. The lesson is stark. The danger is not Darwin, nor even atheism alone. The danger arises when psychology, ideology, and a pseudoscientific authority intersect, creating an environment where moral compass is optional, human life negotiable, and survival becomes law. If we fail to understand this link, we risk watching history's bloodiest lessons play out all over again. If you are thinking that history is replete with human cruelty under religious banners, you are correct. The Crusades, the Inquisition, jihads, witch hunts, and countless religious wars are undeniable evidence of the destructive potential of belief systems. I do not deny these facts, but if you are imagining this undermines my argument, then you misunderstand the point entirely. The key difference lies not in the existence of atrocity, but in the intellectual mechanism used to justify it. In religious violence, there is an acknowledged authority, however flawed or twisted: God, Scripture, divine command. Even when perpetrators commit unspeakable acts, they can claim obedience to an external law beyond themselves. There is a moral framework, distorted, contested, or outright manipulated, yes, but it is still rooted in transcendence. The crusader or inquisitor could, and often did, believe they were serving a higher moral purpose. There is accountability, at least theoretically, to something greater than human will. Contrast this with secular, Darwinian-inspired atrocities. Here, the external authority of God is replaced with the internal authority of science and natural law, selectively interpreted. The individual, or bureaucrat, is no longer answering to a transcendent moral law, but to a descriptive empirical claim about the natural world, dressed up as prescription. The strong survive, the weak perish becomes not a statement about biology, but about society. Hitler did not claim divine mandate. He invoked Darwinian logic and racial theory as his guiding principle. Stalin did not invoke scripture. He cited historical materialism, progress, and the survival of the collective. Mao did not invoke God. He invoked revolution and scientific socialist inevitability. You may ask, why is this distinction important? Because secular scientific justification is uniquely seductive and insidious. In religiously framed atrocities, one could, at least in theory, appeal to conscience or reinterpret scripture. In a science-based atrocity, the justification is empirical, objective, and untouchable. To question it is to appear ignorant, irrational, or anti-progress. The result is moral disengagement on an industrial scale. Dehumanization, bureaucratic organization of killing, and meticulous systemic implementation. Patterns across ideologies reveal a striking consistency. When a fixed moral standard is removed, whether God in secular frameworks or ethical absolutes in pseudo-scientific ideologies, the same structural consequences emerge. Systematic dehumanization. Once people are reduced to labels, unfit, backward, counter-revolutionary, subhuman, they are no longer seen as individuals. They become categories to be erased. Justification of murder. At that stage, killing is renamed. It is called progress, duty, or necessity. The crusader invoked God, the Nazi invoked evolution, the communist invoked history. Different banners, same betrayal. When an ideology discards objective moral law, violence becomes virtue. Bureaucratic implementation. Modern atrocities are not just individual acts. They are organized, methodical, systematized. Paperwork, policies, reporting chains. Murder becomes management. The closer humans get to thinking they are guided by universal law, natural selection, historical materialism, the more efficiently they can administer atrocity without moral friction. You may be thinking, this is extreme. Exceptions exist. True, but these exceptions do not negate the pattern. They merely highlight the fragility of moral systems when ideology overrides conscience. Herein lies the distinctive horror of secular science-based justification. It clothes moral collapse in the language of reason. Religion has excused killing as obedience to God. Philosophy has excused it as duty. Ideology has excused it as progress. None of these are acceptable. All are distortions. But Darwinism and atheistic rationalism add a new layer of danger. They erase God, dismiss absolute morality, and silence conscience, leaving only a cold, mechanical law of survival. Once misread as morality itself, this supposed law becomes a mandate to destroy the weak. The result was not ordinary cruelty, but an unprecedented system of mass killing, presented not as sin or crime, but as science and necessity. If you are thinking, then religion is just as bad, why single out Darwin and atheism? Then consider the subtle distinction. Religion, at its worst, wields authority that can theoretically be questioned, interpreted, or appealed to higher conscience. Scientific ideology, misapplied as morality, disarms conscience by masquerading as fact, leaving humans free to commit horrors with the comfort of rationality. One can argue, and history proves, that this comfort is a fertile breeding ground for mass murder. In short, comparative atrocity analysis confirms a pattern. Remove fixed moral standards, whether divine or ethical, and human cruelty escalates predictably. But when the justification masquerades as science, untouchable, rational, empirical, the psychological, structural, and social mechanisms combine to produce atrocities on an industrial scale. It's not merely human cruelty at work. It's what happens when ideology, stripped of moral anchor and dressed up as rationality, unleashes our darkest instincts without restraint. You may be thinking, this is history. Darwinism influenced Hitler, colonialism and communism, but what relevance does it have today? But the truth is that the ideological currents of Darwin have not vanished. They have simply mutated, finding new vessels in technology, policy, economics, and culture. Consider the explosion of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and algorithmic governance. At first glance, these are neutral tools, but observe the assumptions underpinning them. Optimization, efficiency, selection of the best solution, and elimination of the unfit or inefficient. The logic is chillingly familiar. Survival of the fittest translated into code. AI systems that rank humans for insurance, credit, job recruitment, or criminal risk may appear objective, but they often reproduce and amplify existing hierarchies, privileging the adapted and disadvantaging the vulnerable. If you are thinking, this is technology, not ideology, then you are overlooking the subtle indoctrination. Algorithms carry the implicit message that competition is natural, hierarchy is inevitable, and survival is the ultimate measure of value. Modern debates over genetic editing, IVF selection, and designer babies echo the same dangerous logic that justified eugenics in the early 20th century. The language may now be sanitized, enhancement, optimization, elimination of disease, but the underlying principle mirrors Darwinian selection. Some traits are preferable, some lives are more desirable, and humans may be engineered to reflect that hierarchy. You may argue, this is science improving health. True, but without ethical grounding, science becomes a tool for the same moral relativism that once rationalized extermination, now dressed in technological sophistication. Look at contemporary social and economic policy, where meritocracy, extreme competition, and neoliberal frameworks are glorified. The rhetoric is often framed in Darwinian terms, implicitly or explicitly. The fittest succeed, the weaker fall behind. From high-stakes education to corporate environments that reward ruthlessness, the same selectionist logic persists, normalized as natural, inevitable, or even desirable. Schools celebrate competition over cooperation. Job markets demand survival skills over ethical consideration. You may say, competition drives progress. Indeed, but when ethics are optional and the vulnerable are disposable, the consequences echo historical atrocities, minus the explicit gas chambers, but not the underlying disregard for human dignity. Subtle indoctrination is pervasive. Television, social media, documentaries, and even progressive policies often frame natural selection, competition, or efficiency as normative moral standards. Phrases like "only the best will survive," "adapt or perish," and "survival of the fittest" slip into discourse, reinforcing hierarchy while obscuring ethical accountability. Children are taught to admire achievement without examining moral cost. Society idolizes success, speed, and dominance while neglecting empathy, collaboration, and compassion. This is Darwinian morality, secularized, disguised as progress. If you are thinking, these are subtle influences, not mass atrocities, consider the cumulative effect: a culture that sanctions competition over conscience, efficiency over empathy, adaptation over morality is fertile ground for exploitation, oppression, and systemic injustice. History shows that when ideology masks itself as rational, objective, or scientific, humans accept it without question. Today's echoes may be less dramatic, but they are structurally identical. Hierarchy is normalized, vulnerability is penalized, and morality becomes negotiable. Darwin's shadow is alive and well. The tools are different, the language modernized, but the principle remains: survival, selection, and the fit dominate value judgments. You may be thinking, we live in a secular age. Morality without religion is impossible. If that is your thought, then consider how easily this assumption has been weaponized to justify atrocity. History shows that when humans remove absolute moral anchors, chaos, cruelty, and systemic oppression follow. Yet there is a path forward, a way to establish moral law independent of ideology, theology, or Darwinian necessity. Objective morality, not a gift from religion, but a principle of reason. Let us be clear, one does not need scripture or divine command to recognize right and wrong. Objective morality can arise from rational consideration of human flourishing, empathy, and the intrinsic value of life. If you are thinking, but that is subjective, everyone interprets reason differently, then consider this. Philosophy has long demonstrated that some principles are universally accessible through reason alone. For example, Kantian ethics teaches that actions must be guided by principles that could reasonably be willed as universal laws. Murder, theft, or deceit cannot survive rational scrutiny as universal principles. Utilitarian reasoning, when carefully applied, considers the consequences of actions on the well-being of all. Actions that maximize harm are inherently unjustifiable. Natural law philosophy, distinct from religious dogma, argues that human beings, by virtue of reason, can discern moral truths that protect life, dignity, and justice. These frameworks show that ethical absolutes can exist without invoking God, while still providing a strong, universal counter to Darwinian or atheistic moral relativism. The danger of moral relativism. You may say, ethics are situational, survival and adaptation matter. True, humans are adaptive, and context influences decision-making. But if context becomes the only measure of right and wrong, morality collapses into convenience, desire, and power. Darwinian thinking, stripped of ethical constraint, exemplifies this collapse. The strong define right, the weak have no protection, and human life becomes negotiable. To prevent this, we need principles that transcend context, laws of conscience, reason, and justice that apply even when inconvenient, unpopular, or personally costly. Practical framework for moral reclamation. How can you navigate a world still shadowed by Darwinian influence? Begin with 3 pillars. 1. Recognition of intrinsic human value. Every individual has inherent dignity. No hierarchy of strength, speed, intelligence, or adaptability can negate that value. This principle must guide action, policy, and judgment. 2. Accountability to universal principles. Laws of morality are not negotiable for convenience or self-interest. Murder, oppression, and dehumanization are wrong even if they seem rational, efficient, or socially sanctioned. Accountability is internal, conscience, and external, society, law, culture. 3. Critical examination of ideology. All ideologies, even scientific ones, must be scrutinized for ethical implications. Science describes reality, it does not prescribe behavior. Human conscience and moral reasoning must evaluate the application of knowledge. You may be thinking, but ideology drives progress. True, progress is necessary, but progress without morality is disaster, as history has repeatedly demonstrated. Darwin's theory explains biology. It does not legislate behavior. Atheism can explain the absence of God. It does not mandate cruelty. To survive morally in a world of ideas, one must anchor judgment in principles independent of ideology. Reason, empathy, justice, and universal respect for life. You may argue that ideology shapes behavior inevitably, perhaps, but ideology need not replace conscience. It can inform, but not dictate, morality. Finally, reclaiming morality requires vigilance. Scrutinize every claim that natural law or scientific principle justifies social hierarchy or violence. Reject the seduction of objective authority that lacks ethical grounding. Embrace moral frameworks accessible through reason, compassion, and reflection, not merely convenience, ambition, or fear. In short, the antidote to Darwinian moral relativism is conscious, deliberate, and universal ethical reasoning. Humanity does not need to surrender morality to ideology, science, or expedience. Conscience, rational principles, and the recognition of human dignity can anchor society against the siren call of destruction. As I bring these pages to a close, let me speak plainly, not as a prophet, not as an infallible judge, but as a human being who has observed, studied, and reflected. What I have written is my understanding, my attempt to trace the threads of ideas, ideology, and human action, and to show where they have gone astray. It is an opinion, yes, and like all opinions, it may be challenged, refined, or even proven wrong, but it is offered with clarity, careful thought, and respect for truth as I see it. I have walked with you through history's darkest corridors, from Victorian laboratories to the smoke and ash of the 20th century, through the machinery of ideology and the subtle currents of modern life. I have tried to illuminate the consequences when science is mistaken for morality, when human conscience is abdicated, and when ideology masquerades as universal law. Yet, I do not claim to hold the final word. I only offer this perspective, that human dignity, moral responsibility, and reason are not negotiable. They are the fragile guardrails that keep civilization from collapsing into barbarism. We must choose them, consciously and courageously, even when culture, ideology, or convenience tempts us otherwise. To you, the reader, I leave this thought. Ideas matter. They shape policies, justify empires, and write the scripts of lives and deaths. Ideas can elevate, but they can also destroy. Therefore, measure every claim, every theory, every authority against the test of conscience, compassion, and reason. If nothing else, let this work serve as a reminder that morality cannot be outsourced to science, to ideology, or to convenience. Each of us carries the responsibility to discern right from wrong, and each choice contributes to the world we leave behind. In the end, what I offer is not condemnation, but reflection. Not dogma, but invitation. Not certainty, but a plea to think deeply, to judge wisely, and to act with conscience, courage, and clarity. For history is not finished, it waits for the choices of those who are alive today.